I would like to start by saying that I believe it is important not only to look at anti-Semitic discourse itself, but to also pay attention to discourses about anti-Semitism. In that regard, Jewish defense organizations play a significant role. These human relations agencies are deeply relevant objects of study, and I'm particularly interested in the ways in which they have approached, understood, and defined anti-Semitism and the kind of narratives that they have developed over time. That is why I have dedicated my doctoral research to the Anti-Defamation League's public discourse on anti-Semitism from 1945 to 2001. The ADL, which ever since its birth in 1913 had as main purpose combating anti-Semitism, has historically played a prominent and distinctive role within the Jewish communal structure of the United States, with wide public reach and influence. However, its public discourse about the new anti-Semitism has not been sufficiently explored, and I hope to contribute to its research, one that can help us improve our understanding of American anti-Semitism. During my PhD process, I became particularly interested in the concept of the new anti-Semitism that the League developed in 1974 through a publication of the same name, written by Benjamin Epstein and Arnold Forster. Though the ADL did not directly publish it, Epstein was national director at the time, and Arnold Forster was associate national director and general counsel. Their ideas, as expressed in the book, fully represented those of the ADL, and they also appeared in other public documents from the League. Curiously, 30 years later, Avram Foxman, who was also national director at the time, wrote another book on the topic called Never Again, The Threat of a New Anti-Semitism in 2004. As I was reading both books and analyzing other primary sources, I saw there were significant divergences and connections between them, and I thought it would be interesting to compare those two visions, addressing how they presented ADL's different and complementary perspectives on the topic of the new anti-Semitism. However, this was something I could not include in my dissertation. I'm glad I can discuss it here today. The key book, The New Anti-Semitism, was first published in 1974, addressing the impact of the 6 Days War and the Yom Kippur War had on the American public regarding Israel. The book presented a narrative centered around the inner apathy of American society towards Jewish issues, primarily Israel, which was a top priority in this period for the ADL and other Jewish organizations. For the League, this indifference was at the core of a new version of anti-Semitism, resulting from a complex shift in perspective about the role of American Jews.
One second, sorry to interrupt you. There is an echo. Do you have two devices running on this call, or is that?
I don't think so.
It's kind of an echo.
Okay, that's not great. Let's see how I can. Oops.
It might be the. Oh, I'm mute. Maybe it's better now.
Is it better now?
Now it's better. Thank you. Okay, let's interrupt.
Can you still see the slides?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Cool. Okay. I don't know where it was. Okay. Okay. For the League, this indifference was at the core of the new version of anti-Semitism, resulting from a complex shift in perspective about the role of American Jews. A new paradigm was developing where Jews, fully integrated in the fabric of American society, were being reshaped as non-victims and part of the establishment, in a context where the Holocaust was being forgotten and the previous coalition between minorities was severely damaged. I think you can, because I'm going to be quoting quite a lot so you can read them in the slides. And I quote, "It is a now generation largely ignorant of the Holocaust, a generation largely unconcerned with, if not hostile to, Jews and Jewish interests, moved deeply and electrically by issues of race, poverty, and war, but not by anti-Semitism or Jews as victims." For the ADL, this phenomenon was manifested through an anti-Zionism that reformulated Israel as a central element of rejection and which emanated from diversified sources that now included the radical left, and more preoccupied for the organization, respectable people who would never consider themselves anti-Semites. And I quote, "The respectable community presents the larger problem. Its indifference or antipathy to Jews and Jewish concerns is far more subtle than the blatant forms of anti-Semitism and religious discriminations against which the Jewish community long ago constructed firm defenses and far more rooted in self-righteousness." And I quote again, "The pressure is being applied not alone by anti-Semitic political extremists, but by many who consider themselves unbigoted, moderate liberals and conservatives." In the book, there are three important elements. One, of course, is the connection between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and how what was happening with Israel had a direct impact on American Jews on a national level. And I quote, "Statements and propaganda manifestos calling for the destruction or dissolution of Israel or equating Israeli defense with Arab assault are seen by Jews as attacks against themselves and world Jewry, and along with other activities supporting those sworn to destroy Israel, are perceived as the ultimate anti-Semitism." And I quote again, "Sometimes it was veiled as anti-Zionism, but the camouflage was transparent, since more often than not, the target was not Israel, but American Jews, viewed now as exploiters of the ghetto." And I quote again, "Just as the Jewish community was viewed as part of the enemy at home, the Jewish nation, Israel, was cast in the same form abroad." The second element of the book was related to the rise of anti-Semitism from the left, not only from the radical left, but also from other groups previously considered by the League as allies. And I quote, "But soon it became clear that the radical totalitarian left, embracing both old blind communist organizations and the multifaceted new left, had taken an anti-Semitic turn away from traditional left-wing opposition to anti-Semitism, and today represents a danger toward Jewry, at least equal to the danger on the right." And I quote again, "The danger on the left is intensified by the fact that our majority in the liberal community, that it is hoped diminishing, including countless numbers of Jews, either fails to see or cannot conceive that the radical left is a threat at all. Yet anti-Semitism can and does come in many different forms, not all of them openly labeled, and despite the denials by radical left organizations that they are anti-Semitic, these groups consistently engage in activity and propaganda in support of policies that are immediately harmful to Jews and in the long run could threaten the very survival of the Jewish people." And I quote again, "In the rhetoric of the Black extremist and left revolutionary organizations, anti-Zionism became a vehicle for anti-Semitism. Israel was labeled an imperialist aggressor. Arabs and the Third World were proclaimed brothers in oppression inflicted by world Jewry." The third element is, to me, the most interesting, which is how the new anti-Semitism was defined by the apathy and blindness of American society towards the needs and concerns of American Jews, specifically regarding Israel's security. And I quote, "A large measure of indifference to the most profound apprehensions of the Jewish people, a blindness and apathy in dealing with an anti-Jewish behavior, a widespread incapacity or unwillingness to comprehend the necessity of the existence of Israel to Jewish safety and survival throughout the world. This is the heart of the new anti-Semitism." This concept of the new anti-Semitism spoke of a fracture between American society and American Jews, as Epstein and Foster put it. It was the beginning of the end of the honeymoon between Jews and America that had started after the Second World War. And I quote, "Is the pendulum swinging back? Is there a new anti-Semitism? Is the old vinegar in new casks out of different vineyards, perhaps? Has moral outrage become moral indifference?" With this, they were also addressing how the moral consensus on anti-Semitism, consequent of the Holocaust, was also starting to fall apart. ADL's 1974 new anti-Semitism formulation was, at its core, an American phenomenon with an international dimension that, as described by the League, mirrored the complex and uneven situation of American Jews, marking the beginning of a new period where the perception of them and their connection to Israel was rapidly changing. As Epstein and Foster expressed it, this new anti-Semitism marked a new rejection, one that was not defined by an obvious antagonism, but by passivity and disdain and inability to acknowledge Jewish needs within American society. And I quote, "It includes often a callous indifference to Jewish concerns expressed by respectable institutions and persons here and abroad, people who would be shocked to think themselves or have others think them anti-Semites. How have we come from there to here, from active sympathy on the part of non-Jews everywhere for the Nazis' victims, contributing to at least 2 decades of unprecedented opportunity for Jewish communities around the world, to an apparent unconcern about the oldest of the Western world's disease, anti-Semitism? Specifically, the League denounced the process of de-victimization, and I quote, "At the same time, a curious phenomenon became apparent in America, an incapacity to hold in consciousness and unconscious more than one victim at a time. No sooner had Jews won widespread sympathy because of their victimization during the Holocaust, no sooner had they begun en masse to climb the economic ladder, the economic and social ladder, than they were replaced as principal victim and object of concern by non-white Americans." ADL criticized how Jews were becoming invisible and how that situation slowed down the Jewish communal agenda and endangered Israel's security and interest. And I quote, "Sympathy for Jews, acceptance of their accession to equal and major roles in society, intolerance of anti-Semitism all seem to have their limits, limits that are exceeded when the Jew is no longer conceived as victim, whether or not that perception is accurate." And I quote again, "The Jews had ceased being victims. Not only were they perceived as not suffering to any great degree, but the minuscule Jewish state had had the incredible gall to prevail 3 times, in 1948, 1956, and 1967. And I quote again, "Jews are tolerable, acceptable in their particularity only as victims, and when their situation changes so that they're either no longer victims or appear not to be, the non-Jewish world finds it so hard to take that the effort is begun to render them victims anew." In essence, ADL's conception of the new anti-Semitism manifested as a way to understand a new context for Jews in America, which had direct impact on their status in social-political space as an American minority group. 1974's formulation was not just a matter of anti-Zionism, but a reflection of how the ADL observed the relationship between Jews and American society, and within that, between American Jews and other, I quote, hyphened Americans and former allies, such as the progressive left, the minority coalitions, and the interreligious coalitions. And I quote, "From racial pride to racism proved to be a short step, and one after another, the leaders of Black nationalism, with but few exceptions, began to expose anti-Semitism." And I quote again, "By the early 70s, it appeared that major elements of the Protestant churches, both clerical and lay, had become so preoccupied with the problems of Blacks in America that they no longer considered anti-Semitism a problem at all, but rather a phenomenon of the past." And I quote again, "If the times now dictate, among influential sectors of the public everywhere, the Jews are expendable in the name of some high moral purpose, the Jews are now perceived as legitimate objects of criticism, scorn, and calumny, the Jewish concerns are not regarded at least on a par with those of other minorities, we have either returned to an old and vicious form of scapegoating, or there is something very new and potentially very dangerous at hand." Indeed, when the book came out, it was both a call to society to reassess the place where it was positioning American Jews in Israel, and a call to the Jewish community to be alert. Let's look now at the 2004 edition from Abraham Hoxman's Never Again. The book focused on the new anti-Semitism, but did so in a way that interestingly differed to that of 1974, as the 2000s saw a popularization of the term influenced by the worsening of the conflict between Israel and Palestine. The ADL redefined its previous version, integrating factors brought by the new millennium, globalization, and online hate speech. The ADL explored a conceptualization of the phenomenon where the weaponization of Israel played an integral part in anti-Semitic rhetoric. One was no longer depicted as indifference, but described as a coherent anti-Israel discourse in the offensive, in a context but the very definition of anti-Semitism was to become a controversial element. It is not surprising that Foxman's book starts directly addressing Islamist anti-Semitism. Though Epstein's and Forster's views definitely included Arab Muslim anti-Semitism, it was not at the core of their conception. America was. 30 years later, Foxman depicted the new anti-Semitism as a global phenomenon directly impacted by the increasing influence of Arab Muslim anti-Semitism within the Middle East and abroad. This new anti-Semitism was global not only in its reach, but also in terms of the actors at play, the international community, that Foxman was calling out on their silent inaction as, and I quote, responsible leaders of the civilized world. While new waves of anti-Semitism were developing all over Europe, Latin America, and also the United States. If we look at IDL's public discourse during the early 2000s, the organization was directly addressing an anti-Semitism that was becoming more belligerent, in which was no longer trying to disguise itself. Under the shadow of the 9/11, the rise of anti-Semitic incidents in Europe, and the harmful impact of the internet, the ADL was clearly preparing for a rise in anti-Jewish hate in the new millennium, and that is what Foxman's book focused on. He specifically identifies, and I quote, the era of the Intifada, the war on terrorism, the deepening conflict in the Middle East, and the broader clash between Islam and the West as the main elements that, and I quote again, represent perhaps the most dangerous times of crisis since the 1930s, end of quote. Foxman's publication of Never Again was, in his own words, a wake-up call, a warning about looming international emergency. Yet, as Epstein and Forster framed it, 1974's conflict was also a critical moment for the Jewish people that cannot be underestimated. And I quote, there is an obligation to alert the Jewish community and the general public, for only when the full information is made available and the full pattern emerges, can persons of goodwill here and abroad call a halt to this fresh injustice. What is surprising then is that Foxman didn't mention Epstein and Forster's formulation nor their book. In Foxman's view, the new anti-Semitism was a contemporary product of the 2000s. And I quote, the re-emergence of worldwide anti-Semitism is a phenomenon of the past several years. And I quote again, in my life, I never expected to witness hatred re-emerging so boldly from darkness. However, there are several examples where both groups seem to coincide. Foxman said that, and I quote, what's most troubling is the way today's new anti-Semitism combines traditional bigotry and hatred with modern resentment in a way that is unprecedented and particularly virulent. Yet we can read this in Epstein and Forster, and I quote, so far, we have been dealing with the conduct of the mass media and other opinion-molding sectors of the American public in reinforcing old stereotypes and creating new negative images of Jews, largely through either insensitivity to anti-Semitism or unconcern about its continuing destructive power. Or in this example, and I quote, in today's new mutant strain of anti-Semitism, traditional elements of the extreme right and extreme left are working together, Foxman said, while Forster and Epstein marked that, and I quote, the age-old phenomenon of scapegoating Jews for economic, social, and political ills takes on an ominous dimension in Latin America, where more than elsewhere, Arab troublemakers find ready allies in the extreme left and extreme right. And I quote again, the Jewish community today, we believe, is a target of a senseless movement from both the right and the left, damned if it does and damned if it doesn't. And I quote again, in the United States, the radical left and the radical right alike were fulminating against US support of Israel. Even in terms of scale, Epstein and Forster couldn't disregard the, and I quote, palpable erosion in worldwide sympathy and friendship for Jews, end of quote, tackling in their book the situation in the Arab world, Latin America, the Soviet Union, and the United Nations. In his book, Foxman didn't directly address that his own organization had already developed a new and coherent proposal of the new anti-Semitism 30 years earlier, constructing a formulation that was particular of its time and place, and already denouncing reality that would be protagonist of the 2000s version. Either consciously or unconsciously, the ADL and Foxman, as its national director, decided to ignore a significant part of the organization's past. The League has generally used history to define anti-Semitism's long existence, but within the organization's framing of its discourse on the topic, it has focused on the urgency of anti-Semitism, which at times means putting aside a more comprehensive overview of its own past. This, I find, happens as well when it comes to the study of the new anti-Semitism. I am not criticizing ADL's actions, as I understand that the focus on current events is central to an agency that battles anti-Semitism, but I would like to argue that promoting the study of the new anti-Semitism within a historical framework that offers perspective and more detailed examination of the phenomenon's characteristics may improve our understanding, helping us to better address anti-Semitism and contract it efficiently in the United States and beyond. This is especially relevant because it is in the 1970s formulation of the anti-Semitism that key roots of the 2000s formulation can be found. To disconnect them is to lose important information and perspective, as both their differences and similarities matter when it comes to analyze American anti-Semitism. As Epstein and Forster's version was America-centered, rooted in indifference and inaction, and directly tackled issues of victimhood, minority relations, and the reformulation of Jewish hatred in the United States, Foxman's approach spoke of global anti-Semitism, a rise in anti-Semitic incidents in Europe under biased media coverage, the spreading of deadly messages from Arab Muslim countries in the Middle East, the increasing impact of online hate, and the key influence of the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Foxman also marked that essentially 2000's version of the new anti-Semitism varied in its intensity, being more widespread, more deadly, and more directly antagonistic with its discourse against Jews worldwide. And I quote, "The early warning signs of anti-Semitism are more troubling today than at any time since World War II," Foxman said. However, there were also key similarities. For instance, Epstein and Forster tried to explain the rise of the new anti-Semitism based, between other things, on the, and I quote, "technological revolution after the war, the age of television, jet travel, of space, of computers, that made people part of an enormous humankind." The new anti-Semitism of the 2000s is also rooted in technological change, with the popularization of the internet in a globalized context of greater connectivity. Epstein and Forster also marked that the new anti-Semitism was a product of the new prominent role of other minorities and immigrant groups in America, which is something that Foxman also tackled in both national and international terms.
Carlota, I'm going to ask you to please wrap up the next minute or two.
Okay, yes, I'm almost finished.
Okay, with apologies.
No problem. Both books highlighted the historical role of anti-Semitism, which is something that the ADL did not do before the late 1960s. And I quote, "Jews are history's favorite victims," said Epstein and Forster, and I quote again, "Anti-Semitism, apparently the oldest and most resilient form of hatred known to humankind," Foxman said. Both books also denounced the use of old stereotypes, the utilitarian approach of anti-imperialistic discourse, the blend of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, the relevance of Israel for Jewish survival and security worldwide, the conflictive role of the radical and progressive left, and, of course, the complexities of Black and Arab anti-Semitism. Other aspects that Foxman highlighted in his books were also present in ADL's discourse between the 70s and the 80s, like Holocaust denial, the start of conflict within university campuses, and the debate over racism. In fact, Foxman mentions the Durban Conference in similar ways to which 1970s ADL defined the UN's resolution that equated Zionism with racism. Moreover, the roots of the debate over the legitimate critique of Israel were also present within Epstein and Forster's book, marking one of the central elements of the current debate on the new anti-Semitism. The way they expressed it may sound familiar to us, and I quote, "Of course, one can be unsympathetic to or opposes Israel's position on specific issues without being anti-Jewish, but many of the anti-Israel statements from non-Jewish sources, often the most respectable, carry an undeniable anti-Jewish message. Some of the public utterances that pass for legitimate discussion mask a real hostility to Jews as Jews. They are often couched in language or contain innuendos claiming anti-Semitic." As final words, I would like to say that the new anti-Semitism does not exist in a vacuum, and that the ADL developed its narrative about it over a long period of time, as we've seen articulating more than just one formulation of it, and attaching it to more than one context and historical period. That is why I think it is important to look at the new anti-Semitism not as a phenomenon or concept that applies to our current times only or to the first decade of the 2000s, as well as reassessing how it is specifically connected not only to our globalized world, but to America and America's anti-Semitism and America's Jewish history. I also think that investigating American Jewish organizations' relationship with anti-Semitism can be useful to further understand the perception about the phenomenon and the kind of key discourses developed about it within the American context. If we gain more historical perspective, we also may be able to reassess how we look at the current phenomenon and see how certain key elements have changed, while others have been reinforced, better understanding the new anti-Semitism in the US and how to counteract it more efficiently, specifically, especially in connection to the role of minority groups and their shared dynamics. And with this, I finished my contribution, though Professor Alvin Rosenthal asked me if I could briefly talk about what the ADL is currently doing today. So it's like 1 minute. If I can do that. 1 minute, okay.
1 minute.
It's the last slide.
It's always a problem in these conferences. We just have to keep everybody to the time frame.
Yeah, I completely understand.
We all have hours of things to say, but we have to keep it focused.
Yeah, I completely understand. The ADL has always used visual tools, public campaigns, law, and education to combat anti-Semitism. Currently, it has diversified its objectives and has a special focus on contracted online hate. There have been traditional themes that the ADL has been dealing with, such as fighting anti-Semitism domestically and globally, domestic extremism, and of course supporting Israel and dealing with anti-Zionist campaigns. There are other themes that have been recurrent, such as immigrant and refugee rights, online hate and harassment, hate crimes, religious freedom, free speech, anti-bias education, and interfaith and interpretations. And there are new themes or newer themes, like education equity, women's equity, voting rights, LGBTQ rights, criminal justice reform, and race and racial justice. Over the past years, the ADL has developed new programs and campaigns, such as Never Is Now, which is an annual meeting about anti-Semitism and hate, the Repair Plan to combat anti-Semitism online, Stop Hate for Profit, to stop racism, anti-Semitism, and extremism on Facebook, Anti-Semitism Uncovered, to guide a guide to traditional anti-Semitic myths, who can be accessed through ADL's website, and includes a section on anti-Zionism, the ADL tracker of anti-Semitic incidents, and has also updated its Center on Extremism, and has created the Center for Technology and Society in Silicon Valley, and the Civil Society Fellowship, the Sports Leadership Council, and of course has continued to develop the A World of Different Institute, who was created in 1985 to deal with anti-bias education, improve interpolations, confront racism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of bigotry.